3 decades of emergency rule in the Arab world's biggest nation. Is there any hope for democracy in Egypt? We'll speak to the Nobel Peace Prize winner who wants to run in next year's presidential election. Good evening and welcome to the program. I'm Christiana Manpour. Tonight, it is not uncommon for a country to declare emergency powers in times of national crisis. But when that happens, and what happens when the state of emergency lasts for almost 30 years, as it has in Egypt, with a population of nearly 80 million people and a professional class that often needs to look abroad for jobs and political freedoms. The Egyptian president, Hosni Mubarak, has been in power since 1981, when he succeeded Anwar Sadat after he was assassinated by Islamic militants. The country does hold elections every few years, but so far the ballot box has failed to deliver real change or real democracy. In a few minutes, we'll hear from one of the most prominent Egyptians on the world stage, the former head of the IAEA, Mohammed al-Baradei, who is now eyeing the presidency. But first, CNN's Ben Wiedemann brings us up to date from Cairo.
There's a restlessness in Cairo these days. Outside Parliament, there are almost daily anti-government demonstrations and workers' protests. The drumbeat for change grows ever louder. Keeping it barely contained is the only regime most Egyptians have ever known, led by an aging, ailing leader. Hosni Mubarak still has an iron grip on power, but after 29 years as president, he's 81 years old and recently needed surgery in Germany to have his gallbladder removed. Officials say he's healthy, though it's not clear if he'll run in next year's presidential election. Mohammed Kemal is a reformer in the ruling National Democratic Party.
If he wants to run, then the whole party will rally around him. If he decides not to run, then the party will convene a general convention and will pick a new candidate.
If he doesn't run, many believe his son Gamal could be that candidate. But Gamal, despite a carefully managed leadership role within the ruling party, has failed to whip up enthusiasm. The result is a political vacuum into which this man has stepped. Known around the world, Mohammed al-Barada'i is a Nobel Peace Prize winner and former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, urbane and tech-savvy. His supporters have set up a Facebook page which has more than 150,000 followers. Compare that to Gamal Mubarak, who has 2 Facebook pages but less than 10,000 followers. Also waiting in the wings is the Muslim Brotherhood, officially banned but tolerated. It's Egypt's biggest opposition bloc, but its leaders have shown little appetite for confronting Mubarak. His recent illness jolted officials in the sprawling Egyptian bureaucracy, says opposition firebrand Gamila Ismail.
If Mubarak fall, this means that everyone will fall. And as I was saying, this situation of panic and fear when he was ill and when he was out to Germany for a surgery, they thought that everything was going to fall in a minute if he dies.
Yet it's not a case of if, but when, because even in ancient Egypt, the pharaohs always died. Ben Wiedemann, CNN, Cairo.
And joining us now from Boston, Mohammed al-Baradei, who, as we've been saying, is the former head of the IAEA and the winner of the 2005 Nobel Prize for Peace. Mr. al-Baradei, thank you for joining us.
Christian, it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Why, sir, after being head of the IAEA, winning a Nobel Prize, do you want to get caught up in Egyptian politics? Why do you want to run for the presidency?
Well, this is not my primary goal, Christian, is to run for the presidency. But my primary goal is to see my country, Egypt, a country where I grew up, making a genuine shift toward democracy. You mentioned, irrespective of the personalities, we have a president who has been in power for 30 years. We have a martial law for almost 30 years. This speaks volume for the lack of democracy in Egypt. It's an idea that it's...
Sorry to interrupt you. I just want to ask you, what would it take for you to run? What changes or guarantees are you seeking?
Well, I'm thinking what you have in terms of guarantees in every democracy in the world: a free and fair election, judicial supervision, international supervision, an independent commission to look after the election, to make sure that the election is not rigged as it used to be, make sure that we have equal opportunity in the media. The constitution has to change, because the way it is crafted right now, it's only a handful of people who have the right even to run for presidency. So democracy is no longer part of the Egyptian lifestyle for over 50 years, and it's an idea that its time has come. I feel odd, frankly, sitting here argue that we need to have democracy in Egypt. It's like sitting here arguing that the earth is flat. You know, it's we need to move to democracy, and we need to move to democracy as early as possible.
Okay.
This is a basic core value.
So are you said it's very difficult even to be able to run. Are you able to run? What do you have to do to make yourself a viable candidate?
Well, I'm organizing, Christian, a grassroots movement to push the government, to send the government a clear message that they need to change the constitution. They need to join the rest of the world in becoming a democracy, and hopefully, you know, between now and the time of the election the autumn of next year, we should be able to get the government to understand that maintaining the status quo is a dead-end street. We have, Ben Widman mentioned, I have 150,000 people on the Facebook. They are active now 300,000 people. In a country with penetration to the internet of 18%, it speaks again volume of the search for change in Egypt, left, right, and center.
So 300,000 people, that's still not really, it's kind of a drop in the ocean when you're talking about a population of 80 million and a potential voting population. And although it's been described as you having the support of the young, the educated, many of the frustrated, that you haven't really broken through, and you can't if you don't have the support of the powerful institutions. Let's say the military, let's say the intelligence, that kind of following, that kind of institutional presence, which you haven't got since you haven't been there for so long.
Well, I think the military is part of the people, and the military is witnessing that Egypt is not in the best shape, that we have 42% of the Egyptian lives on a less than $1 a day, Christian. We have 30% of the Egyptian are illiterate. We have Egypt ranking 123 in the Human Development Report. So all the indicators saying that unless we change drastically and empower people, we are going nowhere. So I believe that even the military, the so-called institutions, understand that status quo is not sustainable.
What about your attempts to try to drum up a signature campaign, to try to get that sort of lobbying for your ability to enter the race? We've heard that a lot of people are afraid to sign up. They're afraid of the consequences if they're caught signing up.
That's true. I mean, it is on the way. We have around 100,000 now that have signed up. I think it would be a snowball effect, but there's a lot of fear remnant from, again, 50 years of repression, Christian. And what I'm telling the people, you have to shed your fear. You have to participate. I can only help you if you allow me to help you. And I still believe in people. And I say my party is the people. I'm not part to any official institution. And as I believe, looking around, going around Egypt in the countryside, everybody is looking for a change for a variety of reasons. People do not see future, do not see hope. They would like to become part of the rest of the world, you know, having dignity, having hope, having their sense of freedom to decide who is to govern them and how are they to be governed. So
if that's the case, they are also nonetheless fairly afraid to gather. That's forbidden under emergency rule, and a recent rally was broken up quite violently. I guess the question is, Are you willing, how far are you willing to go to get on the ballot and to get these changes that you're talking about? Are you willing to be arrested? Do you have concerns about your personal safety?
Well, there's a lot of concern always about personal safety, but as you know, Christian, I've been working in an area where there has always been concern about personal safety. That's not my primary concern, but I'm ready to go all the way to make sure that this country, who has been the beacon of modernity, moderation of the Arab world, and change of Egypt, will have major impact on the rest of the Arab world. I'm ready to do all the way because I think the Egyptians deserve much better than what they have today. And I want to emphasize again, this is a peaceful, non-violent movement, but it's a popular grassroots movement. And everywhere I go, everywhere I travel, there's massive support for change in Egypt, Christian.
And so just finally, how do you plan to do this, to mobilize all these masses that you're obviously going to need if you have any hope of being a viable candidate, especially when I'm understanding that you don't really have an official staff or even an official headquarters?
Well, it's very funny because for the people, I'm a real agent for change. For the regime, I'm a virtual person. I can't even have a headquarters. I can't raise funds. But we have a lot of volunteers. We have a lot of young volunteers everywhere in the country right now, canvassing for change, explaining to people how change will impact on their economic and social life. So there is still a lot of hope. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how it will play out. It's, you know, in a country when you have no level playing field, it's like a black hole. But I will do as much as I can. I think I owe it to, you know, to Egypt. I owe it to humanity that every human being should have the right to live in peace, freedom, and dignity. And dignity and pride is what is missing right now in Egypt.
On that note, we'll be watching. Mohammed Al-Baradei, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure, Christian.
And just how do politics affect the everyday life of people in Egypt? On amanpour.com, we have the story of what one man in Cairo is doing to cut his energy prices in half. And coming up, how will the ruling party respond? We'll hear from its leading parliamentarian.
I do have an unyielding belief that all people yearn for certain things. The ability to speak your mind and have a say in how you are governed. Confidence in the rule of law and the equal administration of justice. Government that is transparent and doesn't steal from the people. The freedom to live as you choose.
That was US President Barack Obama speaking in Cairo nearly a year ago about the importance of democracy. But Egypt, a steadfast ally of the United States, has made only limited steps towards political pluralism. We're joined now by Ahmad, one of the leading members of President Mubarak's National Democratic Party. Mr. Ez, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Christian.
Let me first ask you, why is there no clear succession?
Well, I would, if you allow me, I would first like to respond to some of the interesting remarks of Dr. Al-Baradei on your program, Christian. Because in fact, Egypt is going through a very exciting time. And Egypt is developing in almost every walk of life. And the political diversity taking place in Egypt today is unseen, unwitnessed in my generation.
Well, let's talk about that.
Is a welcome. Yes, Dr. Al-Baradei is a highly respected Egyptian, is a welcome participant in this vibrant political debate. He has a clear path to run for president in 2011 if he so chooses.
You're going to have some political pluralism, and whether or not somebody such as Mr. Al-Baradei will be able to run. And let me ask you why I ask this. Because somebody, indeed, Mr. Amr Moussa, head of the Arab League, and who's sometimes mentioned as a potential presidential candidate, has said, when asked whether he will run, the road to the presidency is blocked. How do you answer that?
Well, as I was explaining earlier before the technical glitch, our constitution anchors politics in political parties with clear political platforms. There are 24 parties in Egypt. Any of these parties can field candidates in 2011. Half of these parties, for example, have asked Dr. El-Baradei to be their candidate of choice. Dr. El-Baradei hesitates, preferring instead to run as an independent. My party, the NDP, has made it clear that it welcomes Dr. El-Baradei to join the political fray. I wish Dr. El-Baradei will do that, because in that situation, he will have to make his position clear on many issues. I have heard Dr. El-Baradei says that he is allying with a huge coalition of Egyptians, when in fact he is allying himself with a fringe coalition, either of the extreme left, nurturing old, tried, tested and failed policies of the 60s, or with an extreme right-wing Muslim brothers who are nurturing democracy a la Ahmadi Najad.
Let me break in there, Mr.
What I want to make clear is, Christian.
Well, you've made yourself very clear, Mr. Ez.
If you allow me to...
Let me just ask you, look, for the last 5 times that Mr. Mubarak has run, he's basically been nominated by Parliament, the sole candidate, and then confirmed by a popular referendum. And as you explained, there was a change made under heavy American pressure over the last time in 2005. But it depends entirely on whether one of these legal parties that you talk about actually chooses to nominate somebody, right?
But Dr. El-Baradei has been asked by half of the parties to be their candidate of choice. He has a clear path to run for president in 2011. It appears to me that the only obstacle to a Dr. El-Baradei candidacy is Dr. El-Baradei himself.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. You say that he wants to run as an independent and that that's not possible, but the Muslim Brotherhood had to run as independents last time. The other big question is, obviously, this state of emergency, these special emergency powers that have been in effect for nearly 30 years, are clearly having a major effect on the ability to conduct politics or political life. Is there any hope of this emergency law being amended or being put aside, and a special anti-terrorism law coming in, as you say, has been debated, because it's affecting all aspects of life in Egypt?
Christian, that is inaccurate. In this heightened level of security awareness in the world, every country is grappling with how better to protect its citizens, including Egypt, and it has always been controversial. You have your Patriot Act. Our emergency law is our Patriot Act. That has only and exclusively been used to either combat terror or to avert the threat of terror. In no way has it been used to suppress either political or social or economic life. Of late, we have uncovered plots by Hezbollah, cells by Hezbollah in Egypt, plots to attack vessels in the Suez Canal. So basically, it's Code Red Alert in Cairo, 365 days of the year. We look forward to a day when we do away with the emergency law that, again, is our Patriot Act, only used to combat terrorism, but that will only happen when the Middle East is at peace with itself.
Oh my
and
goodness.
Then we at the NDP will be the first to want to do away with that law.
All right, now that may be a very long time from now, and everybody understands that the fight against terrorism globally has to go ahead. But the question is then, why are some of these laws used to crush political rallies, for instance, as happened earlier this month when the police really did break up in a harsh way what was a peaceful rally? Why does that have to happen?
Christian, walking into my parliamentary chambers, if I can use the term, every day, I am in my face faced with good Egyptians who are demonstrating en bloc for either political or economic or other grievances every day in my life, in parliament that is. So that caricature image of an Egypt that is stifling dissent, with no plurality, with no freedom of expression, is far from the mark. There are at least, at last count, 240 publications in Egypt, 15 TV networks. Dr. El-Baradei, for example, the little time that he is in Egypt, last time that is, has appeared on almost every newspaper of reference, on the front page, continued to hold political rallies, has visited the Al-Azhar Mosque, has been on every single talk show. So, I mean, that notion of combating by force political dissent or political pluralism in Egypt is not true.
All right, Mr.
There
Ez.
may be an aberration now and then from either side.
Mr. Ez, on that note, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Ahmed Ez of the ruling party in Egypt. And we are also joined by Saad Eddin Ibrahim, an Egyptian intellectual who spent 3 years in prison on charges of defaming the Egyptian state. He was later acquitted, but he's now living in the United States, teaching at Drew University. Tell me, Mr. Ibrahim, what you make of the current situation in Egypt. What are Mr. El-Baradei's chances of actually running for the presidency in a way that makes sense?
Well, he has a good chance. After all, the whole world has changed in the last 30 years drastically in ways that 40 years ago nobody would have anticipated that Eastern Europe, even the mighty Soviet Union, will fall. So everything is possible nowadays. And therefore, I say Mr. El-Baradei, in the little time since he announced his intention to go back to Egypt and to engage in a political campaign for reform, has shown that it is possible. And I'm confident that if he persists, if he gets an organization going, if he leads by example.
Can he get an organization going?
Sure he can. There are a lot of volunteers. He spoke very well earlier in this program, and I believe that he could, and there are hundreds of thousands of people. The problem is, he's a challenger, and we heard from an apologist for the regime, Mr. Ahmad Ez. The problem with the regime is that it has narrowed the windows for any competitor so much that it will take nearly a miracle to change. But miracles do happen in the Middle East. After all, that is the region where all the miracles took place.
As you know, in the last round, there was a movement, the Kafir movement,
Yes.
Enough. Now, the leading candidate, the head of that movement, was basically roughed up. He was charged on what many call trumped-up charges of fraud, and he was put into prison.
Right.
Is that something that is still a worry? Does that have a chilling effect? Will that happen again to a challenger?
Well, you are talking to an example here. Mr. Az can talk the talk, but unfortunately the regime does not walk the walk. Here I am, an intellectual, 70 years old or above, who could not guarantee his freedom when he expresses himself. Never used violence, never called for violence, and yet the regime had, as you indicated, had put me behind bars in 3 trials, and now I have about 7 cases pending against me in Egypt today, and that's why I'm in exile right now.
So what exactly do you think is going to happen in the next round of presidential elections a year from now? Will Mr. Mubarak run, or will his son be the successor?
I think one or the other. Most likely he will be the one, because the son does not seem to have fired the imagination. The son does not seem to have created the kind of appeal that would be necessary for a sustainable and serious campaign. Mr. Baradei will have a good chance, and I think millions of Egyptians are willing to rally behind him. And if external powers could also demand that next election, be free and fair and transparent under international supervision, I think we have a very good chance of changing Egypt and the Arab world.
On that note, right now we're going to continue talking with Mr. Ibrahim at cnn.com/live too. Welcome to the webcast portion of our program today, where we're going to continue our conversation on the next presidential election in Egypt. Is there a chance for democracy? What is the succession plan there? And we're going to talk to Saadetdine Ibrahim, Egyptian intellectual who's been imprisoned and who has a lot to say about what's going on there. Now, we must say that we did invite both Mr. El-Baradei and Mr. Ahmed Ez to join this webcast portion of our conversation, but they both declined. So, Mr. Ibrahim, you're saying that if countries such as the United States and others weighed in heavily on this issue of democracy, that would help push the situation along, do you think?
Absolutely. And that's what happened in Eastern Europe, Eastern and Central Europe, with the Helsinki Accord back in 1975. The West made it conditional to grant aid and recognition to regimes in Eastern Europe only if they allow the margin of freedom for civil society. And when that was allowed, the whole world changed with it.
But to be fair, that is true. But let's just take it around the Arab world. It did also start from within. There was a movement in Russia, in the Soviet Union. It did have a domino effect. And does there seem to be that comparable opening of reform amongst the leadership in the Arab world? There doesn't right now, does there?
Not among the leadership, but among the grassroots. And as both Mr. El-Baradei and Mr. Ez acknowledged, that every day there is a protest of one sort or another. What people do not recognize is that Egypt today has 1.4 million state security agents in the country capable of breaking or undermining or defaming any political challenger. And that's what they did with Ayman Noor, that's what they did with me, that's what they did with several people. And therefore, the reason why you do not hear as much or we do not have as massive rallies as sometimes happened in Eastern Europe is that state security forces, those 1.4 million strong, who break any crowd. And as you indicated...
Well, Mr. Ez said that's just an aberration. But give us the actual facts of how one can organize politically in a country like Egypt today.
Well, you have to do it in defiance. You have to do it through what I call civil disobedience. The way that Gandhi did it, the way that Martin Luther King did it in this country. You do not wait for a permit from a state or from a regime that is bent on staying in power and not sharing power and not rotating power.
Well, do you believe then that if Mr. El-Baradei were to join the presidential race, it would take something as dramatic as declaring civil disobedience?
Absolutely. And he has to act by example. He has to be a Gandhi. He has to be a Martin Luther King. If he is capable of doing that, he has to be, we talked about Eastern Europe,
Václav
Havel, all kind of leaders who really took it on themselves to lead the change have to do some sacrifice and they have to lead by example.
So what do you make then of Mr. Ahmed Ez, again, of the ruling National Democratic Party, telling us that Mr. El-Baradei has been invited by several of the current political parties to run?
You know, there are 13 conditions to run for the presidency. 13 conditions. And this is unprecedented.
Such
One
as?
of the I'll give you 3 or 4. One is that you have to have been a party member, not just join a party, for at least 1 year before the election. Number 2, you have to be on the leadership of that party, not just a regular party member. Number 3, you ought to have never carried the nationality of any other country, even if you give it up. And there are 5 or 6 other conditions that are put there in one article called Article 76. This is the longest article in any constitution in the world. 4 pages. Have you seen a constitutional article, one article that's 4 pages, equal to the entire constitution? And that is the article bearing on the running for the presidency.
So let's say they have such draconian measures in place that basically prevent most people from running. Then why is there no succession plan even? I mean, President Mubarak has been in power for 28 odd years.
Yes.
He's 82 years old. It's no secret that his health has not been good. And yet, he doesn't even have a vice president.
Well, the conventional wisdom in Egypt, the political talk in Egypt, is that the family, the Mubarak family, has been grooming one of the sons, Gamal Mubarak, who is now a leading figure in the NDP, the ruling party called the National Democratic Party. Now, the appearance of Mr. Barade and the scene seem to have fouled up this succession scenario that the Mubaraks and the NDP have been working on for the last 10 years. And therefore, there is now a reconsideration of what to do. And most likely, Mr. Mubarak himself, if his health can help him, will run, because if he runs, he has a better chance than his son.
And if he runs, that means
it will be a real contestation.
It will be what?
It will be a real race. If he runs, and with Mr. Barade running, under international supervision, it will be a real contest, and it will be a real election, and that could usher democracy in the entire Arab world.
When you talk about a real contest and a real democracy, you know, obviously under President George W. Bush, there was a real hope for democracy. He had a freedom and democracy agenda. And then that was laid out in 2005. And then, obviously, once the Muslim Brotherhood started winning, once Egypt started to get pretty upset about this, the U.S. pulled back from that. Secretary of State Condi Rice at the time pulled back from that. And yet you're saying that there needs to be pressure or encouragement from the United States. Is there, do you think there's any way the U.S. will re-enter the democracy game in Egypt and places like that?
I hope they do. I hope other Western democracies, the community of democracies, weigh in, including the EU. I hope for the sake of the Middle East, for the sake of the Arab world, that that will be done. We have examples now, Muslim countries like Indonesia, like Malaysia, like Bangladesh, like Nigeria, majority Muslim countries that have engaged in democratization, and it was not the end of the world. So the fear of Islamists is highly exaggerated, and sometimes the autocratic dictatorial regimes feed that fear, reinforce that fear. And that is why there is almost a knee-jerk reaction in a country like the United States to the idea of allowing democracy. And as you indicated, once Hamas won an election in Gaza or in the West Bank, the Bush administration unfortunately retreated from its freedom agenda. I hope the US and the West generally will continue to act in a principled way. Support democracy as a value, support democracy as a system of governance, regardless of the outcome.
And how do you think President Obama has done in terms of supporting democracy and moving that agenda ahead?
Well, he gave a very impressive speech in Cairo. However, he has not followed up on it. He seemed to have been duped by some of our dictators that somehow they will deliver an Arab-Israeli peace if he can stop talking about democracy and about change. And unfortunately, he seemed to have succumbed to this temptation. So far, no follow-up. And as the program indicated, it has been over a year now, a year and 1 month. And you say, all right, what have you done for democracy in the Middle East? If anything, they have reduced the funding for democratic transformation in the Middle East.
Saadeddin Ibrahim, thank you so much for joining us on this webcast portion of our program.
It's always a pleasure to be
Thank
with
you. Thank you very much.
Right.
And that does it for this special edition. You can watch our whole program at amanpour.com. For all of us here, goodbye now from New York.
Another goodbye here, Christian.
Thank you. Okay. Good. Now, just watch I've got to do a goodbye page for the TV. Just stay where you are, but put, so that's not hanging.
Here you go, Christian. Stand by. Here we go. 4, 3.
That's it for now. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back tomorrow with a preview of the 3rd British election debate. Until then, check out our podcast on amanpour.com/podcast. You can see it whenever you like. And for all of us here, goodbye from New York.